Al, I'd just like to thank you so much for doing this. This means a lot, and it's great to get some information about this guitar as close to the source as possible. So, yeah, I guess my first question for you is I've read a bunch of things about how the finish came to be, but, you know, my question to you is, yeah, where did this guitar finish come from?
That is a very interesting story, and I think in your email to me, you hit the nail right on the head. What happened is this is born out of basically builds of Coronado 2s that were happening in the late 60s. And the Coronado 2s have this nice binding around the edge. These are semi-hollow, instruments that Fender was making in the late 60s. And the edge of the binding sort of got burned or scorched in the production process. And so instead of throwing away these beautiful instruments, they decided to develop a finish that would allow them to still use the paint jobs, right? So they developed the Antigua finish to kind of cover up some of the small burns that were around the edge of the binding there. And they created this Antigua finish. And it's really interesting that it pops up in the catalogs in the late 60s as actually, it almost looked like they named the whole model Antigua. So if you look in the catalogs, you'll see that they have the Coronado 2, and then the Antigua 2 is listed like separately as a separate model with this finish in there. Right. But it was born out of Fender saying, hey, let's just cover up those, the inconsistencies of the binding with this burst. And it started out kind of as a much darker burst to that interesting yellow. And then in later years, you see that it kind of morphed into a different kind of Antigua that you have in your hands there.
It's one of those things, and you see that like a lot in various aspects of music and the music industry. It's like, it's an unfortunate accident that turns into something like really cool. Like you find that same thing in like recordings. Oh, we got this limitation, we can't do this, so we gotta make lemonade out of lemons, and it turns out to be pretty cool. Awesome. Yeah, that totally answers that question. So my next question is, you see a lot of hate for this finish online. It's pretty divisive, but there must have been like a certain level of demand for Fender to put all their guitars out in this color. So yeah, I guess my question is like, was it popular at the time?
That's a very interesting question as well. It's hard to really go back and find out exactly why they reintroduced the finish. So going back to the history, it was on the Coronado and it was called the Antigua. Looks like it came out of the catalog right around 72, around there. And then it disappears. And then all of a sudden in the 77 catalog, I think it was, all of a sudden Antigua appears as an option on the Strat, the Tele Deluxe. All these instruments, like a host of instruments, all released with Antigua. And I'm not exactly sure the history of why they decided to do that back in the day, but it only lasted in the catalog for about 3 years, between 77 to 80. And I think it was very polarizing, just as it is today, even back then. If you look through vintage instruments for sale, you don't see a heck of a lot of Antiguas out there, right? So it seems to me that we didn't build a heck of a lot of them between 77 and 80. And some of the models are very rare to find them with those finishes, like a Tele Deluxe, with an Antigua finish, very hard to find. And so it's interesting. I think back then, it was just as polarizing as it is today, with some people either loving it and thinking it's the best thing since sliced bread, and other people thinking, wow, that's just really too odd for me to even consider liking.
One of the things that I've kind of read around forums, and who knows what truth there is to it, but apparently like there's a lot of guitars sold that are like 79s, 70s, 79s, whatever, that are refinished natural. So like one of the theories that floats around is that a lot of people bought these guitars and then over the years refinished them, and that's where the resale is. Like all these guitars that are being sold as refinished natural were originally Antiguas. So hard to say if there's truth to that, but it's an interesting theory that I've seen floated about.
Yeah, I'm not sure I actually heard that rumor before, but I think you're right that it's always been polarizing.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was only around for a short period, I think speaks to the fact that it was so polarizing. It probably wasn't the best, the most popular color at the time. I think that's pretty safe to say.
Yeah, I definitely think so. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I got 2 more questions for you. So the next one is, so CBS takes over Fender in 1965, and they change a bunch of things with the guitars. And I know that this era gets a pretty tough rap, but I also feel like now people are kind of coming around to these guitars. So my question is twofold. Do you sense this shift as well? Why do you think people are changing their view on it? And I guess, what do you think about this era?
Well, let's address the first part of your question. I do think that the attitude towards the 70s era is changing. I definitely have seen that. The fact that people seem to really dig the larger Strat headstocks, first of all, those seem to be pretty popular these days. A lot of people love the big headstock look. I think part of the reason that has happened is, number one, time. Okay, so people at the time were experiencing, kind of a lull in Fender's popularity and maybe even quality for a certain amount of time. And at the time, that was right in their face because it was in the 70s and they were buying instruments in the 70s. Now it's 40 or 50 years removed from that time period. So a lot of people maybe have forgotten or just never learned that there was ever a lull in Fender's popularity back in the 70s. And so I think new players that are just getting into Fender, players that are just getting into electric guitar, aren't born with that stigma of Fender, post CBS 70s kind of malaise. They don't have that bias at all. I think some of that bias has just naturally been bred out of people because they're new players that are younger that simply don't know that history, that part of the Fender history. Also, I think the 70s, it kind of gets a bad rap because, as you discovered, there's still plenty of examples of fine instruments that were made in the 70s. All the stuff in this, there's stuff that, like amplifiers, guitars that play great, that don't have horrible neck pockets, that, even some of the advancements in the 70s were actually improvements that are great that we still use today, like the headstock adjust truss rod. In the 70s, when they introduced that, it was obviously accompanied by the bullet. We still use headstock adjust truss rods on every instrument.
Oh, it's way better. Way better.
That was a great advancement that was born in the 70s, right? Even if you look at the 3-bolt neck, that got a bad rap because a lot of times it was executed poorly and people complained of the neck moving around. We make a lot of 3-bolt necks today as in the form of reissues, and if it's executed properly, it's a perfectly fine neck attachment. And we just have a little bit better consistency now building our guitars than maybe they did in the 70s. So I think the 70s kind of gets a bad rap. There's plenty of great amplifiers, drip edge, amplifiers, and even the 70s tellies and strats. Some of them are great. Even on the Antigua finish, I'm personally a big fan of the Antigua finish. I'm in the camp that thinks it's, I don't even think it's so ugly it's cool. I actually think the color is nice. It's got a very interesting burst that goes from that yellow to the outside burst, which is almost like kind of green and gray. I love it. I love the guard that's painted that matches it.
You're one of the few that I've found you're one of us.
I do. I love it. And it's interesting because Japan has reissued the Antigua finish, many years ago. We even did a reissue kind of Fender special run of Strats, Tellys, Ps, and jazz basses out of our Mexico factory in 2012.
You can get it in the mod shop too.
Yeah, that's right. So we have a history of kind of reissuing that finish. But again, going back to the earlier question, I think the 70s kind of gets a bad rap. Certainly there's examples of bad stuff, but there's lots of examples of good stuff too. Just like that guitar that you've got in your hands right there. I played plenty of great Strats and Tellys from the 70s, plenty of great Telly Deluxes. There was some great stuff back then. But I think part of the reason people are more in tune with that now is, number one, the 70s are truly vintage now. The general definition of something being vintage is 20 years or more. The 70s are like 40 or 50 years ago, right? So they're really vintage now. And if you look at the prices of some of these instruments, they're anywhere from $3,000 to $7,000, depending on the model you're looking at, whether it's a Jaguar or a Telly Deluxe or a Strat. So the prices certainly show that people are digging those instruments. Otherwise, they wouldn't be paying those high prices for them now.
Yeah, sure.
And the good ones are out there.
I think another thing that would add to this. Like, I just think of my experience with 70s. And I worked in a guitar store when I was young, and I never had that stigma for a while, like 70s bad. But I did start to see like the reissues of the 70s. I was like, oh, that's cool. It's cool to see a guitar with that headstock. And then it just automatically kind of put it into my head that, oh, if it's come back, that means the original ones must be super cool. And so when I started actually like coming across, I was like, oh man, 70s stuff, it's awesome. But that's also, like you said, like I didn't live through it. In the same way, like I love Sweet Child of Mine because I didn't live through Sweet Child of Mine coming out. And when I tell guys who were like teenagers during that era, they hate that song because it was everywhere. So
yeah, same kind of thing. Yeah, time heals all wounds, they say.
I think that's I mean, that's more than everything that I need covered. So again, yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I greatly appreciate it.
Of course, man. It's great to meet you, Steve. And anytime you feel like you want to have a talk about other stuff, we'd love to do some more with you.
Awesome. I'm going to show you one more thing while I have you on the line here. This one.
By the way, when did you? I got to ask you when you acquired that Antigua that you've got there, and if you wouldn't mind showing it to me again. I think it was a maple board, right? Oh yeah, I see it right there. Yeah.
Maple board. It's got the skunk stripe in the back, which I think they all do. So it's not like the capped neck. You know what's so crazy about this one is that like it's got like no wear on it, no wear anywhere on the neck. There's a little bit of a scuff here. There's a little bit going through the pick guard. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, that's got to be a reissue. Like you're pulling my leg here, and so I had to like check the serial number and everything because it's just in like such great shape. But I guess like the thing that really made me sure of its certainty was the frets were originally like down to nothing. It was basically a fretless guitar, and I got it refretted. But yeah, it's a gem. And I live in Winnipeg, middle of Canada, small city, 700,000 people. There's not a huge market for vintage guitars, and so whenever they come up on the buy and sell or whatever, like the prices are a little bit more reasonable than other places because like there's not a huge music community here. Nobody can afford to pay like big prices. And typically that's what somebody wants with a vintage guitar, but also like these guitars usually mean something to people. And so more than once I've heard people say, I just don't want to sell it to a lawyer, right? I don't want to sell this guitar to a psychiatrist. Lawyer specifically, like I've heard that exact phrase. I don't want to sell this to a lawyer like 3 or 4 times. And so then you're like narrowing it down to like a musician who actually has money in the city, which is few and far between. And then I think it just drives the prices down. So I got this one for 3,000 Canadian dollars.
In that shape, that's quite a nice price.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty pumped on that. I'm going to show you this one too. This is my other CBS Fender. This is a 68 Telly.
Beautiful, Lake Placid blue.
Yeah, but it's a refin and I got it refinished because it was in horrible shape when I got it. Like somebody had taken a sanding belt to the whole thing and then played it for a while, and they cut a bevel into the back a little bit here. So somebody had kind of
look at that.
Yeah, somebody had mistreated this guitar for a while. So it was actually kind of nice because I got it for pretty cheap, but also I didn't feel bad about going and getting a finish that I actually liked because the damage had already been done. But
that's a 68?
Yeah, 68. I checked the serial number, and it's also they've got the stamp on the neck too. So
that's a really nice piece.
It's cool, isn't it? It's fun showing these.
Yeah.
It's fun showing them off. These are my 2 vintage guitars. And I've got a buddy who has like a near mint 63, and he's not even really a guitar player. His dad wasn't a guitar player, but his dad bought it, put it in the closet, true definition of a closet classic, and then gave it to his son on his wedding day, who also has done the same thing. And every now and then I get to play it, and it's just like, that's one of the ones where I'm like, okay, I get it. I get why people spend so much money for these.
Yeah, it's fun to own a piece of history, and then also have it. The thing about guitars is they can last forever if you treat them properly. Mm-hmm. You can have a Fender that was built in 1954 that, if it was maintained properly, it still plays as great as it ever did back then today, right? So that's the other cool thing is you could literally own a piece of history that you can actually use at your gigs and record with, and you can make it your own. And it could be something from the 50s or 60s. That's one of the coolest things to me about vintage instruments is they still work, and they're still just as good today, maybe even better, because over time they kind of age and season and all that. So that's the fun part about the vintage stuff.
And the mojo. Well, again, Al, thank you so much. I really greatly appreciate this. Martin, thank you for setting this up. I've got more than I need, so if you want to pop back in at any point, Martin, it's all good.
Awesome. All
good on my front.
Awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, this was really awesome. I'm glad we could set this up.
Yeah, me too. Thank you again.
For taking the time, guys.